for joining us here this morning at the International Institute for Strategic Studies US, the Washington home of IISS. My name is Sam Charap. I'm Senior Fellow for Russian Eurasia here at the Institute, based here at the IISS US. The IISS, for those of you who don't know us well, is a global think tank with a total of 4 offices, including our mothership in London, but also Bahrain, Singapore, and here in DC. The Bahrain and Singapore offices grew out of the 2 regional security dialogues that the Institute has pioneered over the past decade, the Manama Dialogue for the Middle East and the Shangri-La Dialogue for the Asia Pacific. The Institute also publishes Survival, a quarterly journal of international affairs, the annual Military Balance, which you see back there on that table, the 2013 edition of which was launched last month, and the Adelphi book series, some of which are on display in the back. This office, the IISS US, is a critical part of the IISS network. We have a dual mission of injecting a global perspective into the U.S. policy debate and getting U.S. perspectives interpreted reliably to a global audience. I should also mention that the IISS is a membership organization, and those who aren't members can find information about membership at the back. Enough about us, though. We're very pleased to have our colleague, our IISS colleague Dina Esfandari here today from London to lead what looks like a fascinating panel on Iran's domestic politics. This event comes at an important time, as I'm sure you all know, as the P5+1 meets today in Kazakhstan with Iran. But today we're going to look at the Iranian issue from a slightly different angle, or level of analysis, I guess. Not the level of international negotiations, but the level of domestic politics. And so, briefly to introduce our panel, Dina Esfandari, who's Research Associate at the IISS Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Program, will present first and discuss the link between Iran's domestic politics and nuclear negotiations. Yasmin Alem, author of Duality by Design, the Iranian electoral system, will focus on the domestic political scene itself in the run-up to the elections. And Afshan Ostafar, got that right, Middle East and Iran analyst at CNA, will focus on the role of the security forces. They will each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion. I should also remind everyone today that we are on the record. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dina. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So, as you mentioned, this talk today is very timely, given that the talks are beginning today, or have begun today and tomorrow in Almaty. And given the positive sound bites that we got from the last round of talks, I want to look at 3 different areas and look at them very briefly so that we have enough time to do Q&A afterwards. Firstly, just to link it to the nuclear talks, just look at exactly what Iran is expecting from these talks. The most important thing it's expecting is reciprocity, both in weight and substance in a deal that it might come to with the West. And at the same time, it would like an agreement on an end goal. Iran understands that the nuclear issue is the issue that is the most important to address first. I think the Iranians are well aware of that. And they're more than happy to, well, we hope that they're more than happy to sit down and come to a technical agreement on their nuclear program in order to address the immediate concerns of the international community. But what's important for Iran is to define 2 things. First, its larger strategic role in the region, and this is something that it would like to discuss with the West, but also have a clearer definition of its relations with the US and the EU. Now, within that, Iran doesn't want to do this under pressure, because the way the Iranians view this is that if we succumb to pressure, then in the future it'll invite more pressure, which is why it's been so difficult talking to them. Now, what's important to highlight is that the nuclear issue is basically an extension of internal politicking in Iran. A fellow Iran analyst likes to call it an extension of the domestic football game. I quite like that. In other words, the different factions within Iran use the nuclear issue against one another in order to either discredit other factions or boost their popularity within Iran. And the perfect example of this was the 2009 fuel swap deal, which everybody picked up on and used against each other. So that was the one thing I wanted to talk about, was just the link between the nuclear talks and Iran's internal politics. Just a quick overview of the state of Iranian politics. The most important thing is that it's characterized by dynamism. The Iranian political scene is absolutely not unified, it's not monolithic. There are a multiplicity of views represented. It certainly isn't like what a lot of people portray it as, a one-man show. There is no single entity that makes decisions. The idea is to rule by consensus. I mean, the supreme leader is, of course, the ultimate decision maker, but he's not the sole decision maker in the regime. And what's interesting is the long-term stability of the system, despite the various setbacks that they have faced. Having said that, although the system is very stable and has been very stable in the long run, it's a system that doesn't have a long-term vision. It's more of a reactionary system. It will react to various events that are occurring either within Iran or around it, and make sure that they turn events to benefit them in such a way that will benefit basically what they're doing. In terms of the supreme leader, as I mentioned, he is the ultimate decision maker, but not the sole one. And a lot of people in Iran are beginning to question his ability to make decisions and to actually lead the country, and his strength within the system. I'm not sure that that will actually lead to anything at the moment, but what will be interesting is what will happen once he passes away. People are questioning whether that will be the one event that will lead to to a shakeup of the whole system, to the change of the whole system, whether it will just be a quiet change in leadership within Iran, and whether the regime will be able to keep all of it under wraps. I think that would be unlikely, because it looks like unless the regime is very well prepared for it, it'll instead lead to more of a scramble for power for his position. And then finally, just a quick look at the elections. I'm not going to go into them too much because I know Yasmin's going to look at them, but just some of the main areas of interest in the upcoming elections. The first thing is that the last 4 presidential elections have all been surprises. Nothing's been clear, and there's no reason why this year should be any different. The scene is very fluid and volatile, and there's absolutely no clarity on where everybody stands at the moment within Iran. Loyalties are usually decided quite last minute, depending on what suits various candidates and various factions. As usual, it'll be an open field, and this year won't be an exception. The elections are a pretty big deal within the Islamic Republic, because that's what gives the regime the legitimacy that they crave so much. It's their litmus test. And the context for the elections this year is that the most important thing is that the regime will have learned from its experience in 2009. And so, in my view, they're going to be very well prepared, and these elections will essentially come and go without too much of a shakeup, without too much happening, and certainly nothing like what happened in 2009. The other thing to keep in the back of your mind is that, the context is that Ahmadinejad, who's now been in power for a while, he's basically considered a failed president. Although he was very popular, he's caused a lot of trouble, but he's just been a thorn in Khamenei's backside. And also, the entire system is quite damaged, largely from what happened in 2009. And so the question is, would a competitive election this year, would something like that be allowed in order to help overcome some of the damage done to the system from what's been going on in the past few years? One of the interesting things, for example, is whether the reformists are going to be allowed to participate or invited to participate at all in the elections. Of course, if they do, this would give, once again, the regime increased legitimacy, and the regime is quite keen to boost its legitimacy as much as they possibly can. And so what they're doing at the moment is they're adopting a dual-track approach, which is allowing reformists to move around more freely within Iran, to take meetings with the supreme leader, for example, all the while cracking down and increasing the number of arrests and cracking down on media as they do in the run-up to most elections. Finally, after the Ahmadinejad debacle of the past while, the supreme leader will want to make sure that the next person that takes his place is someone that he can trust, someone that he can support fully, and that has, will basically carry out the will of the supreme leader. The problem is that the people that he can trust are not necessarily the voter magnets in Iran. And so what will be interesting is to see how he's going to react and what he's going to do, whether he's going to give up the opportunity to have somebody he can trust fully in power in order to gather as much votes and increase his legitimacy or not. Some of the election issues that are going to be discussed, like everywhere else, elections in Iran are also very much local. And so, although the nuclear issue is quite important for us, it's actually quite a minor issue within Iran. The main issue that the candidates are going to run on this year is the economy. Although the economy is suffering, it's not a total disaster at the moment, and some economists are actually calling it just a period of economic adjustment rather than economic collapse. So the significance of the elections and the nuclear talks. The first thing is that in my view, it's unlikely that a deal will happen anytime before the elections. I think the supreme leader doesn't want Ahmadinejad to get credit for any deal that they might come to. And so part of the reason why the Iranians have been quite forthcoming and quite positive in the latest round of talks is basically because they're trying to just calm the situation down, signal to the international community that they're happy to stay, negotiate, continue dialogue with the West, but buy time until these elections are over. The next president will not necessarily have a different role, but he does present the regime with an opportunity for face-saving. The supreme leader wants the flexibility of being able to blame the failure of a potential deal after the elections on the new president, whom he can then call inexperienced or useless, or the variety of things that he'll come up with. But also, having a new president in place will mean that he'll be able to channel new initiatives through this person. So it'll be very interesting to see basically how things are going to pan out and which way the supreme leader is going to lean during the next elections.
Thank you very much. Well, yes.
Thank you to IISS for the invitation and for organizing such a timely discussion. Let me begin by briefly talking about Iran's domestic politics, which is the topic of today's discussion, and then work my way back to the question of how internal developments, namely the June presidential elections, might impact the nuclear talks. So Iranians just started a new calendar year, and without a doubt, one of the principal challenges in the next few months for Iran's leadership will be the upcoming presidential election. I think last time such elections were held, things didn't go quite as planned, to put it mildly. There were allegations of fraud that created massive street protests that were subsequently spilled over to the political arena, and they created one of the most imperiling crises for the Islamic Republic since the 1979 revolution. This year, the stakes are as high, if not higher, than 2009. The United Conservative Coalition that conducted the 2009 elections and the ensuing crackdown has been shattered into pieces, and Iran is under unprecedented international pressure. Now, factionalism has always been endemic in Iran, but the level of elite infighting that we're seeing today hasn't been seen in years. Electoral politics tends to be an unpredictable and opaque game, as Dina mentioned. So I think when Yogi Berra said never make predictions, especially about the future, he was thinking of Iran. So I'll heed that advice, and I won't make any predictions. What I'll try to do instead is to give some context, highlight some past trends from presidential elections, and then talk about how these elections are a little different. And I think Dina mentioned a few of these points. So I'll start with the first one, which is these elections are turning out to be more interesting than previously forecasted. I think pundits have a habit of writing off Iranian elections as predictable and lackluster affairs. But since 1997, of the 4 elections held, 3 have been major surprises. Khatami's 1997 election win was certainly not expected. Ahmadinejad's 2005 win as the 11th hour man wasn't expected, and then 2009 was quite something else. Second, I think what we're seeing is internal divisions among the political elite growing ever more intense in recent months. And that has created this sort of polarized political environment. Now, that isn't something new to these elections. There's always been a lot of polarization in the run-up to a vote. What's different this time around is that the 2 decades-long characteristic of elections in the Islamic Republic, which has been the pitting of reformists against conservatives, will probably not be the focal point of these elections. Having spent significant political capital, the Supreme Leader is unlikely to reverse course and let reformist candidates truly run in these elections. Now, that doesn't mean that there might not be second and third rate reformist personalities, but this will be an intra-conservative contest and a likely showdown between forces loyal to the Supreme Leader and those who are close to President Ahmadinejad. Third, Dina mentioned this, but presidential elections are about showing popularity and legitimacy. So what we've had in the past is, in the months leading to an election, the regime has employed a panoply of tactics to encourage participation. It's allowed more space for debate in the press, it's eased social restrictions, and generally allowed a relatively relaxed political environment to emerge. This time around, security will trump legitimacy. The regime will take every possible measure to prevent a redux of 2009, and we've already seen evidence of this. The security intelligence apparatus has initiated a crackdown on the press. Dozens of journalists have been arrested since January, which is quite early to begin with the arrests. There have been several newspapers and magazines that have been shut down, and authorities are choking up internet access. So yes, they've learned their lessons from 2009. Finally, if the events of the past few months are any indication, Ahmadinejad's exit augurs to be anything but smooth. And this is quite interesting. I think this is the first time that the transition of power is going to be a bumpy ride. With the last 2 presidents, you had a smooth transition. This time, because Ahmadinejad's post-presidency prospects are not very clear, it's going to be bumpy. I think more importantly, he's passed a number of red lines, and the Supreme Leader will try to eliminate him and his team. The prospects for his close circle of associates is not any better. A lot of them are under judicial investigation, so this administration will probably leave kicking and screaming. So what does all of this mean for the nuclear talks? Let me start with the most lingering question. Can Iran compromise and accept a deal in the middle of an election season? And this is where Dina and I differ a little bit. I say the short answer is yes. The very fact that Iran agreed to a relatively high tempo of talks, and I mean the technical meetings in Istanbul and now Almaty too, that's taking place over today and tomorrow, is a testament to the leadership's openness to a deal. It's important to keep in mind that unlike US elections, key decisions in Iran rest with Iran's supreme leader. And unlike President Obama in 2012, the supreme leader is not running for re-elections in June. Does that mean that the 2 sides can reach a comprehensive agreement? Probably not. But that has more to do with a deep level of mistrust and the huge gulf of expectations that exist between the 2 sides. Let me take a moment and briefly explain why having some sort of agreement or some progress, let's call it progress, in the nuclear talks might be an attractive option for Iran's leadership. A modest accord can help alleviate some of the psychological duress that the Iranian markets have been grappling with in the past few months. So sort of economic reassurances would be valuable for a country that's dealing with 31% inflation rates according to recent results. By the same token, I think if there are less economic concerns, the leadership and key decision makers can focus on the post-Ahmadinejad era and the transition. So a good deal is better than no deal. There is a caveat, however, and Dina alluded to this. I think the only scenario that Iran, in which the elections could squander the opportunity for an agreement, would be if there is a serious case of political turmoil at home. Something similar to the 2009 imbroglio. Under those circumstances, the supreme leader and key decision makers might not have the bandwidth to deal with internal threats as well as the nuclear talks. And as Dina said, this is part of the reason why the 2009 swap offer in Geneva failed. They came back with a deal, and opposition figure Mir Hosseini Mousavi started attacking Ahmadinejad's government, which was under question because of the election debacle, and the Iranians had to back out of that deal. In terms of impact on possible candidates, I think if the talks yield positive results, everyone will try to get political mileage out of them. So there are those who argue that if Saeed Jalili, Iran's top negotiator, is able to reach an agreement, that will boost his chances for the presidency. Others, as Dina mentioned, argue that the supreme leader might not want to reach an agreement in the final months of President Ahmadinejad's tenure, because that might give Ahmadinejad a boost. I'd say if any agreement is reached, it will be because the leader has given his green light. So given that he controls the media and the majority of the propaganda mechanisms and instruments in Iran, the agreement will be portrayed as a victory, whatever it is. And anyone who dares to criticize it will be accused of sedition, deviation, being a traitor, etc. I think conversely, if the talks fail, everyone will take a belligerent stance and talk about resistance. Iranian politicians know all too well when it comes to matters of national security, they need to shift with the political winds that emanate from the pinnacle of power, and they will do that. That's why we haven't heard anyone really talking about Iran's core stance on nuclear issue in the last few months. Finally, let me end with these concluding remarks. Iran's nuclear policy is set by the Supreme Leader's office, not by the president or the Iranian people. So when a new president is sworn in August, it's unlikely that he will usher in a major shift in Iran's core issues. And by that I mean the nuclear policy, relations with the West, etc. But Ahmadinejad's successor might have some influence on the agenda setting. And that will really depend on who the next president is. So say if someone like Ali Akbar Velayati, who was foreign minister from 1981 to 1997, and has been serving as Supreme Leader's advisor on foreign policy, is a long-time regime insider, has a proven record of respecting red lines, and knows where the ultimate source of power comes from, is sort of selected, then he will be able to influence the nuclear policy more and have more leverage in terms of streamlining the policy over Iran's bureaucracy. I think we need to keep in mind that the next administration will not change the core of Iran's nuclear policy, but it can change its tone. And we've seen that. President Khatami's tone when it came to the nuclear talks was quite different than President Ahmadinejad's. And along that line, I think a less bellicose rhetoric could lead to a more constructive dialogue and pave the way towards reaching something that's a little bit more long-term and an agreement that's more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for coming. It's a beautiful day outside. It looks like it's going to be, so long live spring. If we're going to stick with baseball metaphors, I'm sort of the cleanup hitter right now. I'm going to try to sort of make a few comments that haven't been made already. I may be a little redundant and emphasize some of the things that you guys have said already. Both of your comments were fantastic. But I want to start by sort of getting at the issue of security forces, namely the IRGC, but all the related security forces like the Basij, law enforcement forces, gangs like Ansar Hezbollah and stuff like that. Within Iran, especially within sort of the reformist sector, but even outside of the left in Iran, there's a real view that the IRGC has been very prominent in influencing past elections, particularly 2005 and 2009. One thing that wasn't so surprising to me about 2009 was ultimately that Ahmadinejad was elected, right? I think what was surprising about 2009 is that Mousavi was able to have this groundswell of support that nobody anticipated. But if you look at the election of 2005, which had very little sort of popular interest, the election went very similarly. You know, Ahmadinejad was a surprise candidate. Nobody really anticipated him. But in terms of the way that the first round at least went, the same sort of gerrymandering, the same sort of accusations against the IRGC and against the regime for fixing the ballot boxes were thrown around. I remember Rafsanjani said that whoever was behind this was going to hell, which was a big deal. But because nobody cared about the election, nobody really paid attention to what happened in 2005. The second round, Ahmadinejad seemed to get some actual popular support, and so the little man rose and became president. Everybody got excited about this guy who liked the Mahdi so much. 2009, of course, was different. And as Yasmin has already indicated, because of 2009, because of how ugly it was, and because it did not go nearly as cleanly as 2005 in terms of getting the preferred candidate his spot, there seems to be a strange sort of narrative in this new round of elections where all sides are kind of talking about a more fair election. Or at least they're talking about democratic processes as if they actually exist, which is interesting. I mean, you have people like Velayati who are telling Ahmadinejad and the government, you know, you guys shouldn't be using your money to promote your own candidates. This is unfair. People should be on an equal playing ground. You have the IRGC playing the same game, saying we're out of politics, we have no interest. However, we will engineer the election, you know, to make sure that ideological and politically sort of inline folks are those that are going to be sort of put forward and voted in on. And you have reformists who are debating among themselves whether they should participate, if they do, how they should participate, asking again for Khatami to come and save the day. And you also have conservatives that are talking about reformists being a good idea that they should run. Some are saying Khatami shouldn't run, Mousavi, Karoubi shouldn't run, but other reformists, sure, they should run. This would be great, you know. And some of the thinking from more moderate conservatives is that if reformists run, actually not for more moderate conservatives, for more extreme hardliners, is that if the reformists run, that they and the Ahmadinejad candidate, whoever that is, Mashai or somebody else, will basically be competing for the same votes and nibble away at each other. And this will allow the hardliner candidate to get a sort of a plurality of votes. So this interesting narrative is going on, but the security forces have maintained, I would say, a very similar line in this election as they have before. The IRGC has been clear about who they don't like, and this is one of the most important ways that they influence elections, at least outwardly, is in terms of propaganda. They use all of their propaganda mechanisms to highlight the folks that they do not find problematic and to belittle, denigrate, or outright accuse of treachery those that they dislike. In this round, those that they dislike are Ahmadinejad and his candidate, which will likely be Mashai, but doubtful if he'll pass the Guardian Council, or somebody else, and any reformists or Rafsanjani or anybody like that. The people that they seem the most favorable to is this sort of tripartite coalition of Ghalibaf, Velayati, and Haddad Adel, who are at least two of which are sort of saltine, kind of boring regime insiders, and Ghalibaf, who's always been this man of mystery, the great mayor of Tehran with the flashy suits and the nice media campaign, who, you know, sort of poses as a wolf in sheep's clothing, depending on where you're sitting. You know, that wolf can be different. So he's never really been trusted by the hardliners. He's never been trusted by the moderates. He's an interesting guy. But at any rate, one point that I'd want to make is that it doesn't seem to me that the IRGC is in any way a decision maker when it comes to who gets elected. I think that's an important point to make, because we often use this narrative that's in Iran that the IRGC does make the decision. I don't think they do, but I do think that they are incredibly influential, both as a precursor to the election in terms of how they manipulate propaganda, both during the election as how they use the Basij to monitor ballot boxes. And the governor of Tehran already said that 99 Basij units will be dispatched to monitor ballot boxes in that province, especially in the city of Tehran. So they're actively engaged in the security of the election, but also behind the scenes as one of the more influential pillars in the regime. I think both Yasmin and Dina did a great job in talking about how power works in Iran, how influence works in Iran, that the supreme leader is sort of the supreme decision maker, but he's not alone, and he doesn't make these decisions in a vacuum, that it's consensus building. And this consensus building is totally opaque from one perspective. Another perspective, it's quite outward. You see all of these different constituencies battling out in their own sort of newspapers and media outlets. But how it actually works, when the decisions are made, if they are ever made as one final decision, is difficult to know. But the IRGC itself is very influential. And I also want to sort of problematize the concept of the IRGC as one unitary organization that makes these decisions. Just as if there's consensus building in the Iranian state, the IRGC too is not a unified, cohesive organization. It also has disparate views and personalities inside of it. You'll remember that the IRGC vigorously supported Ahmadinejad in 2005, tepidly supported him in 2009, absolutely detests him right now. And same with folks like Ghalibaf. Ghalibaf has always been kind of liked, even though he's a former IRGC commander, but also kind of seen as suspicious. So there's not a real unified candidate that the IRGC is putting forward either. So when we talk about IRGC influence, when we talk about the influence of the security forces, they are, make no mistake, I think the most influential actor when it comes to both any security-related policy issue or event in Iran. And also, and this is how I'll transition to the nuclear issue, on any strategic policies that are made within Iran. Strategic issues like the nuclear issue are not the domain of the president at all. They are the domain of the security forces, the armed forces, and the Supreme Leader's office. How I'd briefly put the Supreme Leader and his most trusted lieutenants. The president, depending on who it is and when it was, has some level of influence in this regard. Ahmadinejad, I think, it seemed to me, had a lot more influence in 2005 than he did in 2009. In fact, in 2009, he was silent for almost 2 years until the last 2 years where he's been sort of back to his old self. The next president, and how much influence the next president has, I think, and I agree with Yasmin here, really depends on who it is. There is some sense, if you can sort of read the tea leaves of the narrative going on now in the Iranian press, there's some sense that there might be a little looseness in who actually gets put forward on the election ticket and who becomes president. I assume it's only going to be among a few choice candidates, that the Guardian Council is going to play a real role, and if there's any real challenge that it will be sort of nipped in the bud and not allowed to sort of really drastically change who's in power or who's in the presidency in Iran. But whether it's Velayati or Haddad Adel or Ghalibaf or one of the other sort of principlist candidates, depending on the level of trust they have with the supreme leader, the level of trust they have with the security forces, the level of trust they have at home and the supreme leader's office and all the other important constituencies, it will really depend on that level of trust, on how much influence they have, both in terms of pushing forward a nuclear agenda, but also to be sort of the face of foreign policy and strategic policy in Iran. So if it's somebody like a Haddad Adel, who's a known quantity, isn't going to really, you would expect, isn't really going to challenge the supreme leader. The supreme leader may feel, and others may feel, that Haddad Adel has, the room and the space to sort of carve out his niche, be a little more influential, have a seat at the table, and so forth. And I think what would be most important in this regard is if the next president is able to unify the hardliners. If they can be all comfortable and settled on a candidate, this will allow Iran to move forward much more effectively in nuclear discussions than if they were to have another president like Ahmadinejad who's divisive. I think what Ahmadinejad has done, more than anything else, is shown that there are real divisions within the regime, that even within the hardliners of the regime, there is no unity. And Ahmadinejad's challenging of the supreme leader time and again has shown that his influence is not monolithic, that he cannot say jump and everybody has to say how high. Ahmadinejad has really sort of embarrassed the supreme leader in this way. And I think from my own perspective, looking at 2009, I felt like, okay, supreme leader Uber Alles, he has unquestioned authority here. By 2013, I think it's clear the supreme leader is much weaker than he was even 4 years ago. Now, I agree with you. I don't think this means much in terms of big decision making. In fact, I would go further and without predicting the future. I don't expect much to change at all in terms of Iran's nuclear negotiations, one way or the other, regardless of who's president. I think the only thing that might change is how comfortable the regime is in its own clothing, how comfortable it is at the table. And in fact, I was reading Twitter just before this thing, and it seemed that the negotiations aren't going very well, that Iran didn't seem the Iran negotiators seemed unsettled and contradictory and got some last-minute change of orders. So I think things like that might change if the president is somehow more trusted, and the government itself, those ministers that make up the government in Iran are more in line with the supreme leader, at least more trusted. So with that, I'll end my comments and I guess open it up.
Thank you very much to all three of you for three very interesting presentations. So now we can open it up, and I'd ask you before you ask a question or make a comment to identify yourselves and who has the microphone coming around, and to wait for the microphone. Please.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, and great to see all of you here. The question, I don't know, maybe Yasmin would know, is there any kind of internal polling that the Iranian regime does to sense who might actually be able to get people to the polls? When you talk about the triumvirate of Ghalibaf, Haddad Adel, and Velayati, obviously it would seem that Ghalibaf might be more charismatic, but I'm just curious whether they have any way of sensing who might draw folks that's scientific. Thanks.
Absolutely. They do internal polling all the time. The security forces, the intelligence forces, the Ministry of Intelligence regularly conducts polls. But I think what's different this time around, and it's part of 2009 and 20 years in the making, is that the regime is not looking for a voter magnet. They're looking for, the supreme leader is looking for someone who is subservient, who is loyal, who has a consistent record, which is something that Ahmadinejad did not have. He's also looking for someone who doesn't have an independent power base and is not popular or charismatic. These are things that will work against Ghalibaf, come time. So I think because of 1997 and because of 2009, the Islamic Republic has realized that when you energize an electorate, when you engage them to this level of 70% participation, 85% participation, then it becomes unpredictable and not manageable. So I think this time around, the choice will not be about the top vote magnet. It will be about someone that in the next 4 years, and possibly, when the Supreme Leader passes away, will be president, and the Supreme Leader will be comfortable with. Remember, he's 76 years old right now. 76. Yeah, I think, because Rafsanjani is 80, and the Supreme Leader is 76. They have 4. So, he needs to think about his succession. He can't have someone who he's uncomfortable with in office in the next 4 years.
Do you want to add something to that, or should we? No questions? Okay. We have a question right here.
Chester Crocker, Georgetown University. I haven't heard the word Syria mentioned, and I wonder if that was intentional, or if anyone is thinking about Syria in terms of the domestic politics of this election run-up. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think the issue of Syria it's definitely an interesting one. It's one that's in the minds of everybody in Tehran, but it won't really be an election issue because, as I mentioned, I think this year, the economy is definitely going to be top on the list, and they're just really going to focus on Iranians, politics within Iran, etc. But within the regime, that Syria is a very interesting thing within the regime right now because it is the topic that's starting to cause even more trouble for various factions in Tehran. A lot of people are starting to question, or have been in the last couple of months, questioning the regime's insistence to stand by Assad, which is probably what pushed the regime to start at least making statements about how they're now engaging with the opposition as well. I think a lot of people often ask me whether the loss of Syria will really be a big deal for Iran. I actually would argue that it won't be. It will be felt, and the regime won't be happy about it, obviously. They've invested a lot in Syria. But the Iranian regime is notorious for basically making the best out of a bad situation. And so they'll find a way around the loss of Syria, just like they found a way around other obstacles put in their path. One of the things, for example, that I think is likely to happen is that should Assad fall, it's not like Syria will be immediately stable afterwards. And so, while the authorities are trying to reestablish control over all of Syrian territory, that's when the Iranians are going to run in and basically start setting the scene for themselves and for continuing to operate throughout there. So it's definitely an interesting issue, but I don't think it's going to be an issue for the elections.
To just add to that.
Go ahead.
I think, also getting at your question, I mostly agree with Dina. On the basic level, I agree completely. But I would add that, this is a strategic issue. And this is one issue that I would suggest that the next president won't have much influence over. What might change is the outward appearance of Iran's support. One thing about Iran, trying to engage the opposition is that the opposition doesn't want to touch Iran with a 10-foot pole, and won't. So Iran, even though they make efforts to engage the opposition, it's for naught. And I would suggest that while, in the grand scheme of things, losing Syria probably is not a big deal to Iran, or would not considerably change Iran's role in the region. I would suggest that to the regime itself, especially to the security forces, that it's a huge deal that they really feel invested in it, and that they feel that losing Syria would be a really big blow to Iran strategically for several reasons. Number one, it would undermine their credibility of arming and continuing to work with Hezbollah. And while Hezbollah is this sort of X factor for Iran in that it's Lebanese, it's not Iranian. Some people think it's a stooge or a puppet of Iran. It's really not. But Iran uses this to really insert itself into major issues in the Middle East that it otherwise wouldn't have any influence in, and that's the Arab-Israeli conflict. You know, this is how Iran gets a seat at the table of an issue that's of major importance to the United States, to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, to everybody else, and they don't want to lose that seat at the table. And Syria is vital to that. It would at least weaken their seat. Two, Iran has very few friends in the region, and Assad is one of those. And so losing a friend is never good. But losing a friend to your rivals is a much bigger problem. And I think Iran sees Syria as much as a battle of maintaining its sort of its route to the Mediterranean, as it does as keeping Saudi Arabia out of what otherwise wouldn't have been a Saudi stronghold. And so it's very much a proxy conflict right now between Iran and its neighbors across the Gulf. And three, and I think you got at this correctly, I think what they're doing now is not necessarily trying to keep Assad and Syria the way it is. I think they are planning on how to keep a foothold in Syria regardless of where the Syrian regime goes. And I think in that way they'll probably be successful, and I don't think the president will have much to say about it.
No, I mean I agree with what you're saying, and like I said, I do think it will be felt in Tehran, but I just don't think it will be as big as a lot of people are making it out to be. Just because Iran, like I said, will jump on it and turn it into something positive. I agree that Assad is Iran's only ally at the moment, but should he fall, then Iran's going to turn around and say, oh, but look, we're becoming friends with Egypt at the moment, have you noticed? Or look how well we're doing in Iraq at the moment, And so they will turn it in a way that won't look as bad as it will be.
Yeah, I totally agree. In terms of spin, I don't think it'll be a PR issue.
So why don't we take two?
I'm Harlan Ullman. The conversation so far has been nicely unemotional and objective, but Iran is none of those things if you read the newspapers or listen to people on Capitol Hill, or even the administration, which is really beating its chest right now. I wonder what you see as an exit strategy, say, a year from now, if there has not been an agreement. And now we really are approaching the so-called red line that Bibi Netanyahu and I think Barack Obama have decided to defer until sometime next year. How does Iran see things? And if we get into a position wherein our negotiating strategies are so different, Iran wants the sanctions list first, we want actions first, we get to a point of almost no return, how would you see that coming out?
Patrick Clausen from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And continuing the trend of asking you to predict where we're going to be a year from now, I would like to hear what you think 1 year from now Ahmadinejad will be doing.
Working for the double I, double
Visiting fellows.
You want to?
I'll say a few words then. Great question. What will Ahmadinejad be doing? Well, he'll either be the regime's new hero, unlikely, or he'll be arrested, much more likely. And beyond that, or they'll just keep him quiet somewhere, which is also, people tend to disappear in the regime, so why not him? In terms of an exit strategy, it's an interesting question. I think the problem in the talks is that, as everyone knows, both sides just don't see eye to eye. In fact, they see so far beyond eye to eye that it's hard to come to a conclusion. I think the Iranians, there are a couple of things that they're going to be absolutely intransigent on. insofar as they can be. One is an acceptance of their right to enrich in some form. I think the Iranians will be prepared to cap their enrichment. I think they'll be even prepared to suspend their enrichment for a while. But at some point there is going to have to be some recognition of their right to enrich. The other thing is they're going to want some kind of sanctions relief. Now, what form that will take, I don't know. I do think, though, that there is a fundamental miscalculation on the Western part if they think that, for example, offering something like relief in recent gold sanctions in exchange for completely shutting down Fordo, which is the core of the Iranian nuclear program, is going to work. I mean, clearly somebody isn't looking at this right. Something that I often say, which a lot of people disagree with me on, is that I actually think that in the situation today, Iran is the country that's in a position of strength. Iran is the country that has a nuclear program that the West wants it to give up. So some people will argue, yes, but the West have sanctions on Iran, and Iran wants the West to give those up. Granted. But the sanctions have been in place now for 30 years, if not more. And the nuclear program continues. So yes, the sanctions are having a certain amount of effect on Iran. I would argue not even on the right people, but they are having an effect. But they're not really changing Iran's strategic decision to continue with its nuclear program. And so here we have this one country that has something that the opponents want them to give up, but they're just not offering enough for it. I think, airstrikes are not going to work, short of them occurring every 3 years on a regular basis, in order to mow the lawn, as a lot of people say. And so, we have this situation of a stalemate. And one side is going to have to give, and in my view, unfortunately, it's going to have to be the West.
If I can just speak to Patrick's question about Ahmadinejad, I think we just need to look at his predecessors to see where he's going to be down the road. Both Khatami and Rafsanjani don't have any role in politics today, and they didn't even challenge the supreme leader. And when they were leaving office, they were actually on relatively okay terms with the supreme leader, and they didn't feel like they would be sidelined or marginalized. That's not the case with Ahmadinejad. The supreme leader might give him an exit strategy now, but down the road, I doubt he will ever come back and play a major role in Iranian politics. So I think his Putinist dreams of enthroning an ally and then coming back in 2017 are long over. I think that he's going to be under tremendous pressure. There are already signs of that. There are a lot of warnings out. There was a documentary just a month ago about Bani Sadr, the first president of the Islamic Republic, and that was a major warning to Ahmadinejad that that fate can really well await you. All of his close associates have judicial files. His former first vice president is being investigated for insurance fraud. I mean, I don't even need to start with Mashai and the number of cases against him. So, his political fortunes are glim at best.
I just want to comment quickly on both questions, which I think are great. One on the, where are we headed in terms of this stuff. There's a perception, I think my own, that on both sides, that they need to either lay the egg or get off the nest. That the time to make a deal is way past, and that we've entered, a very dangerous period that has made sort of tensions so high that any miscalculation, let's say an IRGC vessel getting too close to a U.S. naval vessel in the Gulf, can escalate very quickly. I agree with Dina in that I think Iran is actually much stronger than they even give themselves credit for. It's hard to know where Iran stands. It's sort of the classic idea of somebody who's so arrogant and so confident, but really just riddled with insecurities, and maybe even self-hatred, I don't know. But what you see with Iran is that Iran has actually gotten really far. I mean, they've pushed red lines constantly in Iraq, and at the negotiating table with the United States. And the United States has not done a whole lot to Iran. So Iran has gotten away with a lot, and they know this. But U.S. policy is such now that there is no way out of this without the United States really reversing course. And I don't anticipate that will happen, both for domestic political reasons, but also for strategic reasons in the United States. The United States would lose significant credibility if they reverse course right now. And I don't think anybody is willing to do that. And that goes the same for the UK and the EU. So I don't think the West is going to give in. I think Iran has to give in. But I think Iran has already sort of achieved so much that it's how they spin that giving in that's the question. Now, I'm not hopeful. I wish I was. I'm sort of a cuff hat monkey kind of guy anyway. So the negotiations have gone on so long that if, as a historian, I look at the past to sort of predict the future, and if you look at the past, they're going nowhere. And sort of to quote the talking heads, I think we're on a road to nowhere. But that road, I think, is leading somewhere bad right now, not good. I'm not hopeful for any conclusions. And on Ahmadinejad, which I think is really a fascinating idea, what I love about Ahmadinejad is he's not a reformist. He's not sort of already part of this outer marginalized circle. He's an insider. He's the president, and he has hardliners that support him, and he has a strange support base that is strangely kind of anti-clerical, kind of young. It's really its own middle-of-the-road thing. And so I think when I'm going to be sort of, sitting at the TV and throwing down popcorn and a soda watching with anticipation is what happens after the election. What's Ahmadinejad going to say? How much of a problem is he going to be? Is he going to be arrested and disappeared or whatever or not? Because I think that he has a real opportunity to completely mess up the system if he wants to.
I think we have time for, we can take two questions.
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. Given the dual nature of the regime, elected government on the one hand, religious leadership in control and with the ultimate power, do you think it would be useful to establish a direct contact and line of communication with the religious leadership? And if so, how could that be done?
I'm sorry, Greg?
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. Thank you very much for these very insightful comments. You had mentioned, I think, Yasmin, that the regime in Tehran would spin any kind of interim solution as being a victory. I'm really interested in knowing which pieces on the table would be most useful for them in doing that. Is it the principle of right to enrich uranium, which of course, in a way, they're pushing on an open door, or is it real concrete sanctions relief? What do they really need to be able to spin this as a win?
So, first question, excellent question. So the first question, excellent. If you mean the religious leadership in Qom, is that who you're referring to? I would argue that they are far from powerful in making any types of decisions on core issues. Since Ayatollah Khamenei has become supreme leader, he's done his utmost to weaken the clerical establishment, particularly in Qom. He's taken away their sort of financial resources. He's made them dependent on the state. So they're a lot weaker than, say, the first couple of years of the revolution. In terms of the supreme, sort of negotiating with the supreme leader, I think the U.S. has realized that they need to be negotiating with the supreme leader's office, and I think they've said that actually just yesterday. One of the senior officials in the U.S. said that they believe that decisions are made about the nuclear program by the Supreme Leader. And that's part of the reason why they're not waiting for political calendars, and they're going to move forward with the negotiations. So on Greg's question, I think a good deal for Iran, and maybe not after today, but generally speaking, is sanctions respite. So they want, if they are willing to negotiate, they want to have sanctions relief. A bad deal for them would be, giving up their strategic assets for symbolic concessions. I don't know, spare airplane parts, etc. Iranians have said since day one that they will do nothing beyond their obligations under the NPT, and so if they are going to make concessions, they expect rewards, and those rewards will probably have to be financial incentives. In terms of enrichment, which I think today's meeting sort of leans towards that, is Iran came to the meeting today, instead of responding to the P5+1 by presenting its own offer. It was a comprehensive offer according to Bagheri, and it had the end game included as well. I think what might be happening is that they're miscalculating. They felt that P5+1 came to Baghdad and then Moscow, and they were inflexible, and then they came to Almaty 1 and they became flexible. So the Iranians might be pushing a little bit to get more, and by more I mean the right to enrichment, and that might be a huge miscalculation in terms of their impact on the future of negotiations.
Can I add a few things? Just to build on some of the stuff that you've said. In terms of negotiating with the Supreme Leader, I completely agree. I think that that what's interesting is the Supreme Leader's back and forth on how much he's willing to negotiate with the U.S. A lot of people say, well, for example, the Supreme Leader made a statement a few weeks ago saying there was, under no circumstances was Iran prepared to talk to the U.S. with a knife at their throat. I think that these kind of statements are consistent with his position in the past, in the past 30 years or so, and actually are not targeted towards a Western audience. So the West should almost disregard that. It's purely, in my view, for PR purposes for the Iranian population to say, look, we're strong, we're standing up to the West. I think that the Supreme Leader and his office are actually quite keen to talk to the Americans in particular, to a lesser extent to the Europeans actually, and despite what he's saying, and I think it's quite important to highlight that. In terms of the question on what the Iranians want, I think both issues are actually quite important: sanctions relief, right to enrich. But I do agree that sanctions relief is the thing that they're going to be able to sell to the Iranian population. I think that going back to what I was saying before, what's important is that the amount of relief that's offered has to be consistent with what's being asked of Iran. And to date, it hasn't been. And granted, the Iranians always shoot for more, but surely that's the whole point of negotiations. You shoot for more and you settle on less. So
If you
if
settle.
you can settle,
If
yes.
you settle.
Granted, if you can settle. But so I think that to date, what's been offered to Iran hasn't quite been enough. Certainly in terms of asking them to shut down Fordo, for example, or the 3 S's, this stop, ship, and shut. It wasn't enough. Now, suspension, for example, a suspension of some sanctions in return for suspension of enrichment for a certain amount of time, yes, that would be possible, and I think that would work. The problem is, I don't think neither the U.S. nor the Europeans are prepared to do that and be able to, just because of restrictions they face internally.
No.
Well, I want to hear you about the direct communication with the religious leadership.
Oh, okay. On the face of it, I think we should talk to everybody and anybody in Iran, regardless of their level of importance. But I totally agree. I don't think they're important at all. Particularly compared to where Qom was, if we can use that sort of euphemism for clerical leadership, where they were, let's say, even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The clerics are important, and not just the clerics in Qom. The clerics are very important in Iran. You have clerical leaders that control entire provinces like Khorasan. They're very important. And they do sometimes have the ear of the supreme leader, and they do have the ear of security officials. So, but when you know the clergy, you know that these guys don't actually even say anything. When they speak obliquely. When they listen obliquely. They make Yoda seem eloquent, you know. So they're not really a middleman that you would want to have. It would be kind of like playing telephone without the telephone. So yes, I think we should speak to them. No, I don't think it would do anything. But what really we should be engaging is absolutely the Supreme Leader's office and the security forces and the government. Unfortunately, I think there are real significant entities in Iran that don't want to establish relationships, like the armed forces and like aspects of parts of the Supreme Leader's office. I think the reason why Iran has not been able to be consistent at the negotiating table is because there are real forces in Iran that don't want a settlement, that don't want to freeze enrichment, that don't want to have relations with the United States, because they see that as really undermining their influence, their power, and their role in the region. And I don't think that's going to change.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for coming today to the WSUS.